In 1961, a physicist imagined something strange. His friend sealed inside a room. Just a lamp, a detector tuned to a single photon, and one instruction. Watch for a flash. Record whether you see it. That's the whole thought experiment. Then the physicist imagines standing outside the door, and he asks a question that still has no settled answer. What was true inside that room before the door opened? The physicist's name was Eugene Wigner. 2 years later, he received the Nobel Prize in Physics for entirely different work on the fundamental symmetry principles inside the atomic nucleus. The sealed room question wasn't part of that. He'd published it separately in 1961, a strange little essay tucked into a book called The Scientist Speculates. Here's the puzzle he laid out. In the standard quantum picture, a particle can exist in a superposition, a kind of both at once, before it's measured. So his friend, inside the room, measures the photon, sees the flash, or doesn't. From the friend's side, it's simple. The measurement happened. The flash was seen. Done. But Wigner, imagining himself outside, hasn't opened the door yet. In the equations he's working with, the whole room, friend included, is still a superposition. Both outcomes. Not settled. Not yet. Two people, one event. If that sounds impossible, that's exactly why Wigner asked it. Wigner's own solution was that consciousness itself collapsed the possibilities into one outcome. The moment an impression reaches a mind, he argued, one definite outcome appears. Historians describe this as Wigner reasoning backward from something. He found it absurd. If quantum mechanics really applies to everything, even a room with a person in it, then something has to break that pattern eventually. He proposed consciousness as the thing that breaks it. Here's where the story usually gets told wrong. Wigner changed his mind. By the 1970s and 80s, he'd moved away from the consciousness explanation himself. Two things pushed him there. First, physicists had developed a much more detailed account of how quantum systems start looking classical, without needing a mind involved at all. Second, Wigner grew uneasy with where his own idea led. If only consciousness settles reality, then whose consciousness counts? Taken seriously, that starts to sound like only one mind is real, and everyone else is a story. That mind is telling itself. Wigner didn't want that conclusion. He backed away from the theory that implied it. A small poll, just 33 physicists, philosophers, and mathematicians at one 2011 conference, found only 2 of them still holding that view. It lives on in philosophy discussions, not in mainstream physics. So if someone tells you, a Nobel physicist proved your mind creates reality, that's not quite it. Even Wigner didn't believe it by the end. What actually survived is stranger and more precise. Not consciousness collapses reality. Something closer to, can 2 observers ever fully agree on a single, shared set of facts? For decades, this stayed a thought experiment. Then, in 2019, a team at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh built a laboratory version of it. Picture 2 separate sealed labs, each with its own Wigner and its own friend inside. 6 entangled photons linked the 2 labs together, standing in for both pairs and the particles being measured. They ran the experiment and compared what each side would have to conclude. If you hold on to 2 very reasonable assumptions, locality and free choice, the 2 labs' facts can't be reconciled into one shared, observer-independent story. That's not a guess. That's a measured result. The relevant inequality was violated by 5 standard deviations. To be exact about what that does and doesn't mean, it does not mean consciousness did anything. It means, under those specific assumptions, 2 accounts of the same event can both hold without collapsing into one story. Now here's where this gets interesting. Roughly 15 to 16 centuries before any of this, A short Sanskrit text had already described something startlingly similar. Not with photons, with states of a single mind. The Mandukya Upanishad, 12 verses, one of the shortest texts in the entire tradition. It opens by naming 3 ordinary states everyone already knows: waking, dreaming, deep, dreamless sleep. 3 different ways experience presents itself as real, depending on which state you're in. In waking, the world outside feels solid and shared. In dreaming, a whole world appears, feels just as real, and vanishes the moment you wake. In deep sleep, there's no world at all. Not even a dreamer. 3 states, 3 different presentations of what's real. Sound familiar? Here's the moment the text turns. Verse 7. It names a 4th. Not knowing an inner world, not knowing an outer world, not both, not some blend, beyond ordinary description, beyond what the senses reach, called, simply, the cessation of all these apparent states. Peaceful, without a second. Now, and this matters later, Advaita commentary is be careful about something. Turiya isn't a 4th perspective standing alongside the other 3. It's not one more observer, with one more opinion, about what's real. The commentarial tradition, Gaudapada's Karika especially, is explicit here. Turiya doesn't compete with waking, dreaming, or deep sleep for who's correct. It's described as what underlies all 3, and is never contradicted by any of them. Let's be precise about the parallel actually being drawn, and what isn't. Wigner and his friend each hold a fact. The Proietti experiment suggests neither fact simply absorbs the other into one shared story, under its stated assumptions. The Mandukya isn't claiming to settle that problem. It's not offering itself as physics. There's no evidence Wigner ever read this text. No meeting, no documented influence. That connection isn't being claimed here. What's being pointed at is a structural echo. Physics found a case where 2 accounts of what happened resist collapsing into one universal fact. An old contemplative text, working in a completely different territory, described a ground that later commentators say is never contradicted by any single state's account. 2 investigations, different tools, different eras, a similar shaped problem. Worth sitting with this directly, for a moment, not as a belief, as a question to actually ask yourself. Right now, you're in something like a waking state. A version of what's real is running, built entirely out of this state. Last night, whether you remember it or not, you were very likely dreaming. A different, complete what's real was running then, utterly convincing while it lasted. And at some point last night, dreamless sleep, no witness, no world, not even absence, just no report at all. Here's something worth noticing. Right where these states meet, there's a moment, falling asleep, when waking hands off to dreaming, and you can never quite catch it happening. The same at the edge of dreamless sleep, and again on waking, when a whole dream world simply stops being real, without any transition you actually witnessed. 3 states, and the handoffs between them happen somewhere you were never quite present to observe. 3 completely different presentations of reality. Same person. None of them are false. All of them, from inside, are completely convincing. So here's the actual question, not a rhetorical one. Is there anything present across all 3 that isn't itself just one more state having its turn? The Advaita reading says, notice you were there for all 3, and yet you're not identical to any one. That noticing isn't a 4th state added to the list. It's what the list was always sitting inside of. Back to the room, one more time. Physics hasn't settled whether Wigner or his friend gets to hold the real story. Some physicists take a relational reading, where facts are always facts relative to an observer, and there's no view from nowhere to appeal to. Others favor an approach like QBism, where the quantum state itself is just a tool for one observer's expectations, never a shared portrait of the world. And others think a result like this signals the theory itself is incomplete and needs revising before we trust its stranger implications. None of those camps has won. That debate is very much alive, right now, among people who study this for a living. Mandukya was never trying to answer that specific question. It was asking something adjacent. Is there a ground beneath waking, dreaming, and sleeping that none of them can override? Two investigations, both still open in their own right, both circling the same shape. What happens when no single perspective gets the final word? Eugene Wigner imagined sealing a friend in a room to ask what was true before the door opened. 62 years later, a lab in Edinburgh built the experiment for real. Roughly 15 centuries before either of them, a text had already pointed toward what later commentators call the uncontradicted ground beneath all three states. Ancient wisdom, quantum mystery, direct knowing, this is quantum gnosis.